Have you ever walked past a hero without even knowing it? Hey, Colonel Broomstick, one cadet snickered, nudging his friend. Missed a spot? Should we file a complaint with headquarters? Laughter rippled through the hallway as the old man bent down to collect an empty coffee cup someone had deliberately dropped. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, just kept sweeping, slow, steady, like he'd done it 1,000 times, like he'd seen far worse than arrogance in polished boots. He was just the janitor, until the 4-star general walked past the podium, past the officers, and saluted him. "Sir, it's an honor to finally meet you." The entire room froze. Cadets who once laughed now stood speechless. They had no idea who he really was. And in the next few minutes, their world and their understanding of respect was about to change forever. At every institution, there's someone you see every day, but never really notice. At Westbridge Military Academy, that someone was Harold Kaine. He moved like part of the building itself, slow, steady, and silent. The cadets would pass him in the early mornings, their boots tapping briskly across polished floors, never bothering to look twice. Just another janitor, just another gray uniform, another cap with retired stitched in fading thread. But what they didn't realize was that Harold wasn't just a man with a mop. He was a man with a past too deep for any of them to comprehend. You could see it if you really looked. In the way his eyes lingered on the wall of honor, in the way his hands moved with purpose, not just routine. His back was slightly stooped. His movements carried stiff reminders of battles not just fought but carried for years after. Ever wondered what secrets lie behind a quiet face? While others at the academy barked commands and strutted like peacocks in pressed uniforms, Harold spoke no louder than a whisper. But his silence wasn't weakness. It was history compressed into a man who had seen more than his fair share of noise. Many veterans live like this after the uniform comes off. Quiet, invisible, forgotten. The wars they fought move on without them, and the country they served barely looks up when they walk by. They take jobs like cleaning floors, working night shifts, or fixing boilers, not because they lack talent or discipline, but because peace for them is found in simple repetition, in silence, in the spaces where no one asks for their rank or reminds them of what they've lost. Harold Kaine was one of them. But there was something different about him, even in his silence. Some of the older instructors remembered hearing his name once, maybe decades ago, but they never asked. The cadets certainly didn't. To them, he was just the guy who buffed the floors before inspection, the man who emptied trash cans and refilled soap dispensers. If they noticed his limp, they assumed age had done that. If they noticed the careful precision with which he lined up the broom after each use, they mistook it for compulsiveness, not discipline. But beneath the gray uniform, behind the calm demeanor, was a man whose eyes had scanned battlefields, not tiled hallways. A man who had issued real commands in real war zones long before these cadets had even learned to salute. There was no nameplate on the academy wall for Harold Kaine. No medals pinned to his chest, no stories passed down in classroom lectures. But make no mistake, he carried more leadership, more sacrifice, and more honor in his quiet steps than many of those who called themselves future officers. And that was the lesson no one had learned yet. But they would. They would. In places built on discipline, there's often a hidden arrogance, especially among the young who mistake uniforms for wisdom and rank for respect. At Westbridge Military Academy, that arrogance had a face. His name was Cadet Mason Trill. Tall, sharp-jawed, with a kind of swagger that seemed rehearsed. Trill came from a long line of military men. His grandfather had commanded ships, his father had worn wings. And now Mason strutted the academy halls like his future stars were already stitched onto his collar. He knew the regulations, but he hadn't yet learned the deeper lessons of leadership, humility, restraint, and honor. And to someone like Mason, Harold Kaine was easy prey. It started small. A tossed paper cup here, a muttered joke there. Someone called Janitorial Command Sector 4's under attack, one cadet whispered as Harold swept near the mess hall. The others snickered. Mason laughed loudest. The disrespect wasn't always shouted, but it was always heard. Loud enough for Harold to notice. Quiet enough for the instructors to overlook. One afternoon, as Harold moved slowly down the west corridor, Mason and a group of second-year cadets followed behind, mimicking the old man's limp. 10 hut. Colonel Broomstick incoming, Mason announced, snapping a mock salute. The hallway erupted in laughter. Harold didn't react, not with a word, not even with a glance. He just pushed his broom forward, steady as always. That made it worse. Because when cruelty goes unanswered, the cruel convince themselves it's harmless. So, they pushed further. One morning, before inspection, someone left a stack of crumpled napkins in a banana peel right outside the cadets' common room. It was a scene clearly staged, placed deliberately in Harold's path. As he bent down to clean it, Mason stood nearby sipping coffee. "Hey, Colonel Broomstick," he said with a smirk, "missed a spot? Should we file a complaint with headquarters?" The group howled. One cadet mimicked a trumpet, pretending to call for reinforcements. Another mockingly began a cleanup drill, marching in circles with a dustpan. Still no reaction. Harold collected each piece of trash without rushing, without looking up. If he heard them, he gave no sign. If he felt shame, he never showed it. But the truth was, Harold Kaine had faced far worse than boys in pressed jackets pretending to be men. He'd seen young soldiers cry for their mothers on blood-soaked soil. He'd carried the names of the fallen long after the gunfire stopped. And when the silence came, it wasn't empty. It was deafening. Compared to that, the laughter of a few arrogant cadets was nothing but background noise. But Mason Trill didn't know that. To him, Harold was invisible, a fixture, not a person. Someone to be ignored or mocked, but never respected. And that ignorance, more than the jokes, more than the pranks, was the real offense. No one asked why Harold always paused at the wall of honor before his shift. No one wondered why his uniform, though plain, was always crisp. No one thought to ask what retired really meant on that cap. And the instructors, some noticed the behavior. A few looked uncomfortable, but no one intervened. Not yet. It was just teasing, they reasoned. Just boys being boys. But what they didn't realize was that every joke chipped away at something bigger. Not Harold's dignity, but their own. Because leadership isn't measured by how you treat those above you. It's revealed by how you treat those beneath you. And soon enough, they were going to learn the difference, because in just a few days, the man they mocked as Colonel Broomstick would stand taller than all of them. And not a single one would be laughing. Before he was Harold the Janitor, he was Colonel Harold Kaine, commander of a special operations unit so covert that most of their missions never made it to a single headline. He didn't wear his past on his sleeve, but it was there, stitched into the lines of his face, hidden in the limp that never fully healed, and buried deep behind eyes that had once scanned war zones for threats no civilian could imagine. Years ago, far from the polished marble floors of Westbridge Academy, Harold led a joint strike force in the Middle East under an operation known only to a handful of generals. The mission was called Iron Echo, a last-ditch rescue deep inside hostile territory. Intelligence had failed. Extraction had crumbled, and the only thing standing between 30 captured soldiers and death was Harold Kaine. They made it back, but not all of them. Harold never spoke about what happened in the northern valley outside Fallujah, but he carried it every step, every night. Every time a door slammed too hard or a cadet's voice echoed too loud in the mess hall, he remembered. Not because he wanted to, but because forgetting would feel like betrayal. His team had nicknamed him Ghost, not just because of how he moved, but because of what he survived. After retirement, when the Pentagon offered him a consulting role, he declined. He didn't want a desk, a plaque, or another round of politics dressed up as patriotism. He wanted something quieter, something that let him stay close to the military world without being swallowed by it. So, he chose Westbridge, not because they knew him, but because they didn't. And maybe that was his quiet protest, a way of showing what real service looks like. Not loud, not polished, not celebrated, but steady, invisible, and tireless. The irony is tragic. Heroes like Harold don't crave glory, but the world forgets them anyway. They blend into the background. They push brooms instead of pens, ride buses instead of limousines, and stand in silence while the very country they bled for walks past without a second glance. The medals stored in a shoebox, the commendations yellowing in a drawer, because Harold Kaine didn't need reminders of who he was. He lived it every day. And if anyone had taken the time to really see him, to look past the mop and the uniform, they might have caught a glimpse of something extraordinary. A man who had once commanded men in war, who had watched brothers fall, and who now chose a life of quiet dignity in the shadows of the next generation. But no one asked. No one saw. Not yet. Because to them, he was just a janitor. And that, perhaps more than anything, was the loudest silence of all. The day of the symposium arrived like a storm the cadets had been bracing for all semester. The Westbridge Military Academy's Grand Assembly Hall had never gleamed brighter. The floors were polished to a mirror shine. Flags stood rigid in their brass holders. Cadets filed in row by row, uniforms sharp enough to cut silence. Medals glinted under the soft lights, and collars sat perfectly in place. Every boot was shined, every hair precisely parted. This was the Academy's biggest event of the year, a chance to impress, to stand tall, to be noticed. But beneath all the pageantry, tension lingered. You could feel it in the way cadets adjusted their sashes one last time, or in the way instructors paced the sides with checklists and radios in hand. This year's keynote speaker was no ordinary guest. General Thomas Reeve, 4-star, battlefield-hardened, legendary. He wasn't just a name in textbooks. He was the textbook. Decorated across 4 continents, survivor of the Siege of Corba, architect of counterinsurgency tactics still studied today. The man had trained generals who now trained others. As the double doors swung open, a hush fell across the hall like a curtain. He stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, calm as a glacier. His presence alone demanded silence. The ribbons on his chest told 1,000 stories. His boots didn't stomp. They whispered authority with every step. Everyone stood. The room rose in unison. Salutes snapped to attention like dominoes falling across generations of military reverence. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. Instead of making his way to the podium where a polished microphone and rows of seated dignitaries awaited him, General Reeve kept walking, past the front row, past the stage, past the flags and the folded speech on the lectern. He didn't pause. He didn't nod. He didn't even glance at the commanders awaiting introduction. He walked straight toward the back of the hall, toward the side quarter, toward the janitor, toward Harold Kaine. And in that moment, so brief it almost didn't register, time seemed to hold its breath. The cadets shifted in confusion. Instructors exchanged puzzled glances. Even the brass on stage leaned forward uncertain. Only one man kept moving with full intention. When he reached Harold, the entire room stopped breathing. General Reeve stopped just a few feet away. The old man had been sweeping near the corner as usual, head down, focused on the same task he'd done for years. But this time, he was seen. The general straightened, looked him in the eye, and raised his hand in a perfect, crisp salute. Not casual, not polite, a full formal military salute. You could hear hearts pounding. A cadet near the aisle gasped. Another dropped the pen he'd been holding. The silence wasn't just stunned. It was reverent. And then the general said, just loud enough to be heard, "Sir, it's an honor to finally meet you in person. Not janitor, not Mr. Sir." That single word shattered every assumption, every joke, every insult the cadets had ever thrown in Harold Kaine's direction, and for the first time in years, the man they had called Colonel Broomstick raised his hand and returned the salute. The silence had turned into something sacred, and the lesson was just beginning. The air in the assembly hall had shifted. It no longer buzzed with ambition or formalities. It held its breath, hanging on the edge of something unspoken, something enormous. The cadets who once saw Harold Kaine as part of the furniture now stared at him as if seeing a ghost step out of history. General Thomas Reeve remained standing at attention, arm held high in his formal salute to the janitor, to Colonel Harold Kaine. And as Harold returned the gesture, slow, deliberate, precise, it was as if the walls of Westbridge Academy remembered what honor looked like. Then the general turned to face the entire room. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of command, the kind of voice used to issuing orders in the heat of battle. The kind that made soldiers move before they even thought. "Before I begin my speech," he said, "there's someone here who deserves far more recognition than I ever could. The cadets sat motionless, frozen in their perfect posture, eyes locked on the stage, or rather the janitor near the corridor. This man led men into battle while most of you were still learning to tie your boots. He doesn't have a wing or hall named after him here, but if there were justice, he would. A murmur stirred in the back rows. One cadet whispered, "Who is he?" Another clutched a notepad, too stunned to write. "You know him as the janitor." "I knew him as my commanding officer, the man who saved my life and the lives of 212 others during Operation Iron Echo." Gasps broke out like ripples in still water. Operation Iron Echo. That name had lived in the shadows of military lore. Whispers, rumors. It was said to be a suicide mission extraction, gone wrong, terrain, hostile intelligence compromised. The odds were impossible. And yet, someone had let a team out alive. Until now, that someone was just a legend. Now he had a face. General Reeve nodded toward Harold and continued, "Colonel Harold Kaine isn't in your textbooks. Most of his record is still sealed. He didn't come here for recognition. He came here because he believes that even when history forgets your name, your duty never ends." At that moment, every memory of mockery came rushing back to the cadets. Every joke, every whisper, every insult. Mason Trill, the loudest of them all, sat rigid, his face pale, jaw tight. The general looked back at Harold with something deeper than respect. "Ah. Sir, I've waited over 20 years to do this face to face. You didn't just save lives. You taught us what leadership truly is." Harold didn't puff up. He didn't bask in the applause that didn't come, because the room was still too stunned to even clap. He simply gave the slightest nod, as if he'd known this moment would come. Not because he wanted it, but because the truth has a way of rising eventually. And now it had. The man they had dismissed as just another janitor was a ghost from military legend, a warfighter whose courage had pulled others out of darkness. And suddenly, all the shiny uniforms and perfectly rehearsed salutes in that room felt small, because now they saw what real honor looked like. And it wore gray. The silence in the grand hall lingered, not out of formality, but out of reverence. You could hear nothing but the faint buzz of overhead lights and the low hum of breath held in collective awe. General Reeve turned to Harold Kaine and said softly, "Would you say a few words?" "Sir." Harold hesitated. For a moment, he glanced at the room, hundreds of cadets in polished uniforms, many of whom had barely looked at him before today. He looked at the instructors lining the walls, the polished plaques behind them, the flag gently shifting on its pole. Then slowly, Harold stepped forward. He didn't take the podium. He didn't ask for a microphone. He simply stood, old boots, gray uniform and all, and began to speak in a low, even voice that carried more weight than thunder. "I'm not here to be honored," he began. "I'm here for the ones who never came back." You could feel the gravity in those words. Cadets shifted in their seats. Some dropped their eyes. Others leaned in. "Leadership," he continued, "isn't about shouting the loudest or marching the straightest. It's about shouldering responsibility when no one's watching. It's about looking into chaos and choosing courage anyway, especially when the people you're responsible for look to you with fear in their eyes." He paused. "You wear these uniforms with pride, and you should. But understand this, rank doesn't make you worthy. Actions do. Sacrifice does. Humility does." His eyes scanned the room, slowly landing on faces young enough to still think they're invincible. "In my unit, we had a rule: no one eats until everyone's safe. No one sleeps until the perimeter's secure. That wasn't written in any manual. It came from respect. And I lost good men following that rule. Men whose names you'll never read because they died before history could remember them." Harold's voice faltered just once. "They weren't perfect, but they were brave, and their silence bought you the right to sit here today." A few cadets swallowed hard. One near the front blinked back tears. "When I clean these halls," Harold said, "I'm not just pushing a broom. I'm walking through memories. I'm honoring ghosts. I'm remembering voices that'll never speak again." Then came the line that would echo long after the ceremony ended. If you truly want to lead, learn how to see the invisible. Not just those above you, but those below, around, behind, because the best leaders never forget anyone. He said nothing more. No dramatic conclusion, no call for applause. He stepped back, arms behind him, head lowered with quiet dignity, and that was enough. The room stayed silent long after Harold Kaine finished speaking. No applause, no movement, just quiet, thick with reflection, and heavier than any metal ever pinned on a chest. It wasn't the kind of silence people fall into out of boredom. It was the kind that demands reverence, that makes you aware of the space you're standing in and the weight of those who came before you. Then one sound broke through. A chair creaked from the middle row. Cadet Mason Trill slowly stood. His face, once so full of pride and mockery, was pale, drawn, his jaw clenched as if trying to hold back everything he suddenly felt but didn't yet know how to say. All eyes turned toward him, but he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Harold. He stepped forward a few feet, swallowed hard, and spoke, not with arrogance, not with bravado, but with something new, humility. "Sir," Mason said, his voice raw, "I'm sorry." A pause, for everything, for the jokes, the disrespect. "I didn't know, but that's no excuse." Harold didn't respond with a speech. He didn't make a point of the apology. He simply gave Mason a small nod, subtle, but full of meaning. Forgiveness delivered without fanfare. And then something remarkable happened. Another cadet stood, then another, and another. Soon, every single cadet in the room was rising to their feet. Not because they were told to, but because they needed to. One by one, they saluted. No words, no ceremony. Just raised hands in silent understanding. Some looked ashamed. Others looked inspired. A few blinked back tears. But all of them stood tall. Not for a general, not for protocol, but for a man they had once overlooked, for Harold Kaine. General Reeve, standing to the side, said nothing. He simply stepped back deliberately, giving Harold the full weight of the moment. He knew, as only seasoned leaders do, when it was time to lead, and when it was time to let others feel the gravity of truth on their own. This wasn't his moment. It belonged to Harold. In that instant, the academy, so full of honor codes, parade drills, and formalities, was reminded of something purer than tradition. Respect isn't commanded, it's earned. And once earned, it demands to be given, even by those who once withheld it. Harold stood still, almost overwhelmed by the sea of salutes before him. But he didn't weep. He didn't smile. He simply bowed his head slightly in return, not for himself, but for the brothers he had lost. The ones who never came home. The ones whose faces no cadet in this room would ever see, but whose sacrifices had paved every brick in this academy. In those few minutes, redemption was offered, and more importantly, respect was restored. Not because Harold asked for it, but because the truth could no longer be ignored. And in that quiet hall full of rising cadets and a bowed hero, history was rewritten, not in ink, but in action. The last salute had barely fallen when Harold Kaine turned. No grand farewell, no handshake parade, no final words, just a quiet pivot and the soft, steady sound of rubber wheels rolling across polished marble. He walked away with his broom cart, same pace, same posture, as if the last 15 minutes hadn't turned the entire academy upside down. As if he hadn't just shifted the meaning of respect in that hall forever. No camera followed him. No officer escorted him. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He didn't need it. He disappeared around the corner like a ghost returning to the shadows. But something had changed. This time, every eye followed him. Every cadet stood a little straighter, not because they had to, but because they understood. For once, they didn't see a janitor walking away. They saw a man who had lived the cost of command, carried the weight of silence, and chose humility over recognition. And that image, that quiet, humble exit, spoke louder than any speech ever could. Because in a world obsessed with titles, with status, with who stands at the front of the room, Harold Kaine showed that true greatness walks quietly with its head bowed and its hands calloused. He didn't leave with applause. He left with silence earned, not given, because it's not a title that makes you honorable. It's sacrifice unseen, uncelebrated, unshakable. In every generation, there are those who serve without asking for praise, who return from war and fade into the backdrop of everyday life, working jobs no one notices, walking paths no one honors. They carry more than memory. They carry pain, and principles, and names of friends who never made it back. Harold Kaine was one of them. And today, the cadets at Westbridge Military Academy didn't just learn about him. They learned what he stood for. Honor that doesn't need an audience. Leadership that doesn't crave attention. And a legacy that doesn't need to be carved in stone to last forever. As the doors to the assembly hall slowly closed behind him, one cadet, still at attention, whispered almost to himself, "That was the real commander." It's not the stars on your shoulder or the medals on your chest that define who you are. It's how you carry yourself when no one's watching and how you treat those who carry the burden of sacrifice. If you believe no veteran should ever be forgotten, share his story so the world remembers the quiet heroes still walking among us. Sometimes the people who teach us the most never say a word. They don't wear medals, demand recognition, or chase applause. They show up, do the hard work, and carry the weight of sacrifice quietly. Harold Kaine reminded us of something we often forget in today's fast-paced world. Respect isn't about titles. It's about character. And leadership? It's not how loud you speak, but how deeply you serve. Especially when no one's watching. In modern America, where we often measure worth by status, wealth, or online followings, this story challenges us to look again, to slow down, to ask, who are we overlooking? The janitor, the veteran living alone, the neighbor with the quiet eyes. Maybe someone in your own life has lived through storms you'll never see and still shows up each day with dignity. So, here's what we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever met someone like Harold, a quiet hero in your community? Or maybe you have a story like his, one that hasn't been told yet? Please share it in the comments below. Let's make sure their legacy doesn't fade. And if this story moved your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Valor Stories, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Because keeping stories like Harold's alive, that's how we honor those who gave more than we'll ever know. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you pass someone in silence, you'll see them a little differently.